Hello, everyone, and welcome to our fourth session of Project Teach. We're just going to give folks a couple of minutes to trickle in and settle in for this lunch and learn. As you arrive, feel free to pop your thoughts in the chat to get us started. Feel free to share where you're calling in from, maybe whose territory you're calling in from. Some folks are tuning in from Facebook today, others are coming in from YouTube. I see about 10 people have arrived so far. We'll just give it another couple of minutes. We have a pretty packed schedule for these sessions, so we won't dilly-dally in this waiting space for too long. But just giving it a couple more seconds. All right. And for those who've just joined, feel free to let us know where you're calling in from. Just using the chat in either YouTube or Facebook. Our audience is growing, Nithya, so maybe we can hand things over to you to get us started.
Thanks, Shauna. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Project Teach, talking about ecology and aims for conserving habitat. My name is Nithya Chari-Harris, and I'm a director of the Coexisting with Carnivores Alliance. I'm joined today by our panel of 3 experts who I will introduce shortly, and by Shauna Dahl, Gulf Islands Forest Project Coordinator with Rain Coast Conservation Foundation. I will be facilitating today's discussion, and today's topic is connectivity conservation. We wish to express our gratitude and appreciation to be here on the unceded territories of the Sauk Nation and of the neighboring Pacheedaht and Siano nations, and of the Songhees, Esquimalt, and the Huasanich nations. I would also like to recognize the dozens of distinct Coast Salish and Nuu-chah-nulth nations on whose territories most of us are in attendance today. Also, it is important at this time to give our gratitude and appreciation to the land, the waters, and the air, and all the diverse life within them that sustain our lives. I would like to invite everyone tuning in today to take a moment to remember whose land they're calling in from, and to make your own land acknowledgement in the chat box. Shauna?
We're getting a phone call from a landline. It's not a sound that you hear often these days. Audience members who've been here for a few minutes, you already know this, but those who are just joining us, you are either joining from Facebook or YouTube. Like Nithya said, you can share where you're calling in from or any questions you might have from today in the comment box on either one of those platforms. We will go through each presenter with time for 1 question per presenter after their presentations, but then at the end, we will have a more fulsome discussion. So if you have a question that comes up for a presenter later on in the conversation, it's okay. We will get to it eventually, so don't worry about that. And with that, we'll turn things over to our first presenter.
Thanks, Shauna. And our first presenter is Dr. Angela Brennan, who works to develop research and data science on biodiversity conservation and wildlife ecology for the Biodiversity Research Center and Institute for Resources, Environment, and Sustainability. She received a Bachelor of Science from the University of Wisconsin and a Master's of Science from Western Washington University and a PhD in wildlife biology from Montana State University. Prior to UBC, Angela spent 2 years working for the World Wildlife Fund on large mammal connectivity conservation in Southern Africa, and continues to be affiliated with the organization as a WWF Fellow. She has more than 10 years of experience studying the ecology and management of large mammal species and their movements in landscapes where humans and wildlife interact. Welcome, Angela.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Nithya. And Shauna, thank you so much. I do most of my work on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. So thanks everyone for being here. I'm super excited to share some of my work with you, which was just lifted from embargo from the journal Science an hour ago. And that work examined the functional connectivity of the world's land-based protected areas. So my talk will mostly be about that and the methods that we've used to identify areas important for connectivity. I will also spend just a couple minutes describing some very new research examining protected area connectivity in Canada. So sadly, we're facing a biodiversity crisis. We're losing species to extinctions, we're losing numbers in the populations that are still around, and we're facing rapid environmental change that is perpetuating and accelerating the problem. The recent IPBES report found overwhelming evidence that nature is declining at unprecedented rates and that this is strongly driven by habitat loss and fragmentation. And now more than 1 million species are threatened with extinction. And these findings are mirrored in other reports like the World Wildlife Fund's Living Planet report, which shows a 68% decline in the average abundance of more than 20,000 populations representing more than 4,000 species. A key strategy for combating biodiversity loss is and has been protected area conservation. But many of us know that there have been shortfalls here in curtailing the crisis because of a lack of coverage, a lack of ecological representation, and a lack of sustainable and equitable governance. Another shortfall is that focusing solely on protected area conservation ignores the vast surrounding landscape that many species in protected areas often still rely on. And at least 90% of the terrestrial world's protected areas are embedded in a matrix of human-dominated fragmented land. And 75% of the world's land overall has been modified by humans in some way. And this human-dominated land matrix, it greatly affects animal movement, as is demonstrated here by Tucker and colleagues, which illustrates how mammal movements can decrease with increasing human pressures. So movement distances of mammals over 10-day periods are on the y-axis against an index of human pressures on the environment on the x-axis. And these movements come from more than 800 GPS-collared individuals from more than 50 species of mammals. So why is this effect of shorter animal movement important? It's because if movement declines, animals may not be able to access nutritional and reproductive resources, which can then affect genetic exchange and the ability to respond to climate change. So as a result of decreased movement in the human-dominated land matrix, protected areas and the animal populations they contain can become isolated, and the flow of these vital ecological and evolutionary processes can become critically impaired and grind to a halt. Global policy has responded to the biodiversity crisis, calling for expanding and connecting the global protected area network so that animals can move and ecological processes can flow. Thus, the connectivity of protected areas is being recognized as essential to achieving global biodiversity targets. And Canada, as a signatory nation to these global agreements, has also mirrored this response with commitments to improve and maintain connectivity of their protected areas. So global and national policies are really taking connectivity seriously. So it's really important that we know what connectivity is. So connectivity is the degree to which the landscape facilitates successful animal movement that then leads to population success via increased individual survival and reproductive success. So ensuring species can move successfully means they can access all these needed resources, they can respond to climate change, and then those genes can flow across landscapes. And because of all that, connectivity is expected to provide ecosystems with resilience to disturbance and to help facilitate species persistence. So looking at this conceptual diagram, connectivity reflects the interaction between organisms' ecological characteristics and the landscape attributes. But often we don't have a lot of species-specific information. So a common practice is to infer connectivity based on the landscape structure alone. And this is called structural connectivity. Like in the case of these two habitat patches that you see here, being connected by this forested strip. We may not know if elk are actually using that strip to move between patches, but we're inferring that it's a likely place because there's cover and it's natural. It may be the case, however, that these patches are actually functionally connected for elk by another route, and this is called functional connectivity. So functional connectivity is getting at the critical elements that we see here. It's looking to describe how ecological characteristics of organisms are interacting with the attributes of the landscape. And this is a more challenging component of connectivity to identify because it requires movement data or genetic data that can describe how animals are moving through the environment. Okay, so then how did we measure functional connectivity globally? Well, first of all, we applied circuit theory, which relates animal movement across a landscape to the flow of electrical current across a circuit. This approach uses a grid of the landscape called a resistance to movement surface. And it uses this surface as a conductive layer where neighboring grid cells are connected by resistors with a level of resistance that represents the friction of the landscape to animal movement. So low resistance grid cells have less friction. And so they're more likely to be traversed than grid cells with higher resistance. And by estimating resistance using both movement data and environmental data, that's how we're able to examine functional connectivity. So using this approach, electrical current is injected at a specific source node that in this case represents a protected area, and connectivity is then evaluated from the pattern of current flow across the resistance surface from the source node to the ground node, which also represents a protected area. And these differing electrical current densities predict the expected net movement probabilities for individuals moving through each grid cell as they travel from source to ground. And here is the entire workflow of the global study in one slide, which is a little unbelievable and crazy to look at, but don't worry, I don't have a ton of time, so I'm just going to walk you through the highlights. So to characterize functional connectivity of the world's protected areas, we use the relationship between mammal movement and the human footprint index that I mentioned earlier to get at the resistance to movement surface. And then we also used a layer of large protected areas from the world's database on protected areas. And we focused on protected areas larger than 35 square kilometers for computation reasons. The resolution of our analysis was conducted at 8.5 kilometer grid cells, also for computation reasons. So these two inputs, we applied them in circuit theory using the freely available CircuitScape software. And we used two different approaches in CircuitScape to get at two different outputs, but I'm only going to talk about the output that I mentioned earlier, which is the pattern of electrical current density, which we label mammal movement probability. And this map highlights where flows of animal movement between protected areas are predicted to be concentrated, dispersed, and impeded relative to the global scale. So from that output, we use the upper 90th percentile of current density values to identify critical connectivity areas, which highlight areas where the flow of animal movement is concentrated because it's either funneled in between areas of high human pressures or because it's where there are large protected areas in close proximity to one another, like in the Amazon basin in South America, which you see in these two figures here. So once we obtained the critical connectivity areas, we then looked at their protection status in the upper figure and the risk of future modification in the lower figure. And what we found is that 2/3 of the critical connectivity areas are unprotected. 70% of those overlap with areas of high biodiversity value. Excuse me. So these are areas where potential conservation synergies can occur, like protecting connectivity and endemic species, for example. We also found that 34% of the unprotected critical connectivity areas occur on land suitable for future agricultural expansion. So these are potentially at risk in the future. Okay, so I didn't get through everything in this work. This is a bit of a snapshot, but if you're interested, please do go read the full paper. And now I want to talk about how I'm taking lessons learned from the global work to study protected area connectivity in Canada. So there's a lot that we couldn't do at the global scale because of computation reasons. And some of these things are still challenging for Canada because of its size. But our goals for the analysis were to include smaller protected areas, a finer resolution resistance surface, resistance that included both human and naturally caused barriers to movement. So like high elevation mountain ranges, rivers and other water bodies. And we also wanted to, excuse me, to use a more Canadian-specific human footprint layer. So at this stage, we've been able to include protected areas down to 10 square kilometers in size, and we're using a resistance movement surface created by Pither et al. That fulfills these other requirements. And we're using the Canadian-specific human footprint layer created by Kristen Hirsch-Pearson and colleagues. So this resistance movement surface was created by expert knowledge about what features of the landscape are most likely to affect the movement of a broad swath of species. So we did not use movement data, but we hope to test how well this expert opinion-based model captures functional connectivity by examining the final analysis with movement data. And this is a look at one of our preliminary connectivity maps, which we had to restrict to ecozone buffered to 100 kilometers to reduce computational effort. We also examined the connectivity of protected areas within 100 kilometers of one another, so we imposed a distance threshold. And we can see the effects of the natural barriers for sure in some of the coastal mountain ranges, coastal mountains rather. And when you really dig into this, you can see some interesting connections and pinch points from the South Chilcotin Mountains to the Stein Valley, which are some of the areas that are of interest for grizzly bear connectivity. And so we're looking forward to examining the functional aspects of this kind of analysis and to see how these methods relate to other people's work going on in the country. And so that's all I have. So I'll end with a slide of my co-authors on this work on the top row for the global work and my lovely Canadian collaborator on the bottom row. And yeah, so that's all I have.
Thanks, Angela. That was very interesting. So I guess the question we would like to ask you is, in this region where we are from, we have a lot of big parks, a lot of refuge areas. It's the Capital Regional District. So how can the local government and the regional government use some of the tools you have, including the resistance maps and others, to develop, to make sure that we have connectivity conservation within the park system?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's a lot of what we're hoping to get at. You know, so one of the key ways that this kind of research is really helpful is identifying pinch points where there's relatively few pathways for movement between protected areas, for example. So those areas are are of high conservation concern because they're at risk of loss if they're further developed or disrupted in some way, because there's fewer pathways for movement in those areas.
So the first step would be to identify these pinch points.
Yeah, so I would use this method to create a map of electrical current density and see if, see where you can identify the pinch points. And another thing that comes out of this method is that it doesn't only identify these concentrated areas of flow that I call pinch points or corridors that are kind of like funneled through areas that are less hospitable to movement, but it also identifies areas where there's dispersed flow, where there's many pathways, and those places shouldn't be ignored either. So, you know, there's two types of landscapes that are really important to think about for connectivity.
No, that sounds great. I think we all need to learn more about these tools. Thanks, Angela. We'll come back to you in a little bit. Okay, we'll go on to our second speaker. And our second presenter is Chris Morgan, who's a geographer interested in parks and protected areas, land use planning, and geographic information systems. He graduated with degrees in geography and cartography, GIS, from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and last year completed his Master's of Natural Resources and Environmental Studies at the University of Northern British Columbia in Prince George. He has worked as a planner for the Minnesota Department of Transportation and now lives in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, working for the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, focusing on real estate and planning of the state's public lands. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you. I'm gonna just try to share my screen here. Let's see. and let me know if that is working okay.
Yes, that's good.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you for bearing with me. I just have the one screen in front of me today. I'm out in the field, so I'm at a public library on the Wi-Fi doing this. So yeah, I'll get right into it. Hello to all of you on the West Coast. I'm coming to you from the Western Great Lakes region. My name is Christopher Morgan, and I'm speaking to you today from the very rural Hatley Public Library in Wisconsin on the traditional territory of the Menominee, Ho-Chunk, and Ojibwe nations. Like was said, I spent the past couple of years at the University of Northern British Columbia in Prince George, and today I'll be presenting on my master's thesis titled Systematic Conservation Planning in Seike Dene Territory, Incorporating Climate Change and Interweaving Traditional Ecological Knowledge. And then I'm going to be focusing on the connectivity aspect of the project. So to give you a better idea of where we were working, it's the north central portion of British Columbia within the Yellowstone to Yukon corridor. You can see Seike Dene territory in orange, and we'll notice that our study area in red is a bit larger. And that was to act as a buffer to better understand ecological processes across the landscape. Because the territory boundary is somewhat ecologically informed, but it is still a political boundary. So after conversations with the community, we decided on this larger area that was built with caribou herds and watershed groups. And since connectivity was one of the main considerations here, we wanted to understand movement in and around the territory. I'll use this topographical map to provide a bit of history and context for the project. The Seike Dene are a Sekani people residing in the northern Rocky Mountain Trench since time immemorial. They had very limited interaction with Euro-Canadians until the fur trade, until subsequent gold rushes brought many more miners and missionaries. Forestry then started to make its way north, and the construction of the Hart Highway in 1952 represented the first substantial connection to the region. So suddenly this transportation impediment was gone. So in the 1960s, the province created a crown corporation that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. That'd be BC Hydro. And to grow this fledgling enterprise, the province constructed a dam near Hudson's Hope. And so that flooded the Peace, Parsnip, and Finlay rivers to create the reservoir. And so with the flooding of the trench, it didn't just sever habitat for wildlife, such as a caribou migration route, but it also caught many Seike Dene off guard and displaced them from camps and villages in the river valley. Until the last 20 years or so, the community has relocated to the northern tip of the reservoir. I think it is really important to note that Seike Dene Nation initiated this project. They reached out to my supervisor, Dr. Pam Wright, about performing conservation planning work in their territory after learning of similar work by some of Dr. Wright's previous students. I just happened to be applying to grad school around this time and was thus very fortunate to be paired with the project. So my research purpose was to essentially identify which areas of their territory have high conservation value, both ecologically and culturally, exhibit landscape connectivity, and are resilient to climate change. So I had these 4 main questions I was looking to answer, but the one we'll focus on today is how can landscape connectivity be explicitly included in the SCP process? And so to help explain the concept of systematic conservation planning, just so hopefully this all makes a bit more sense, I like to use the analogy of finding the perfect berry patch. One patch might have the biggest blueberries, another patch might have blueberries, huckleberries, cloudberries in close proximity, and another patch might have a nice breeze that keeps the mosquitoes and black flies away. And so what systematic conservation planning comes down to is identifying areas that have lots of these desirable like characteristics in close proximity, or have a characteristic that is so rare that it isn't really found elsewhere in the study area. And so while there is a well-established SCP process, blending it with traditional ecological knowledge has only been attempted a handful of times. Since the nation was the foundation of the project, we sought to involve their knowledge and expertise whenever possible. So that largely meant explaining the importance and implications of each stage of the process and allowing nation staff to guide the decision-making throughout. It also meant blending TEK data and values with Western science-based data sets for a number of what we call conservation features. And so traditional ecological knowledge is often thought of in a material sense, but there are several dimensions or faces of TEK, some of which are more abstract than others. The traditional aspect is meant to convey the intergenerationality of this way of knowing, but I also respect that some people take exception to the word traditional in this context, as it can erase the knowledge and ideas of those living today. Regardless, I would argue that applying indigenous ethics and values in decision-making is an equally valid form of TEK. So by interweaving traditional ecological knowledge, I sought to use GIS technology to empower a community and share an accessible and defensible expression of their conservation goals, a form of counter mapping. So that meant using GIS to speak in the same language that governments and industry often operate in. By then allowing Seike values to shape this process, local voices, views, and understandings were etched into this work. And so the main theme that really emerged there was the importance of providing sufficient context and conveying the implications of each decision that had to be made. But I still wanted those authentic ideas from the nation and not answers that were overly pigeonholed to fit into this conventional SCP framework. I alluded to conservation features earlier. This is a list of the features or various layers that we were putting into this planning tool. I'm not going to go through all of them. I just wanted to convey some of the categories and also convey that it was a lot of them. But because we are talking about connectivity here today, that'll be our main focus. And the subsets of these connectivity analyses that I ran to then include in the planning tool. Here's those categories that our conservation features fell into again, but just trying to illustrate in a graphic to help you visualize they were essentially stacked atop one another within the prioritization tool. Next comes the human footprint, or mapping areas of development and disturbance. I ended up developing 3 different footprint layers based on the level of permanence of that type of human development. And that allows the user of the tool to select which one makes the most sense based on their needs. And this is just an example of some of the features that went into the footprint layers. In our context of northern BC, this is what that ended up looking like. The Williston Reservoir is in the center, very obvious, and then a lot of the dark purple permanent features are resource roads reaching into the more remote stretches of the territory. A lot of the sort of medium hot pink color are going to be cut blocks that you see. And so this information was very much refined during a workshop with nation staff, largely used provincial data sources, and then enhanced that with local knowledge on the site of additional development that might not be captured in provincial data yet, as well as nuance on relative impacts of development in this local context. I like to use this little GIF whenever possible, just because it's a nice way to illustrate the idea of connectivity and how human development can sever those linkages. But yeah, just to explicitly include connectivity in this planning tool, I had to decide which tools to use, how to use their outputs in the planning tool, and then assess their subsequent solutions. So I greatly appreciated Dr. Brennan's explanation, because it spelled out a lot of what I did, and she touched on a lot of the same tools that I used in my project. So in this case, we ended up developing a resistance layer. And so the human footprint I just talked about is a very major component of that. But it also takes land cover and slope into account. So you can consider how really steep slopes and snow and glacier covered areas are generally more difficult to traverse. So then the resistance layer becomes the basis of the 2 connectivity analyses that I performed. The map on the left looked at connectivity between existing and proposed protected areas, and that tool is known as Linkage Mapper. It's generally more suitable for highly fragmented environments where the goal is to connect islands of natural areas, whereas the map on the right looked at connectivity of the landscape overall, and that's known as Omniscape. So that tool is better suited for landscapes that are relatively intact, which I would argue is the case in this context. Both of these tools still use electric circuit theory and this theoretical flow of electric current across the landscape to quantify the connectedness based on how much resistance is faced, whether that be, again, from slope, land cover, or human development. I modeled what Dr. Brennan referred to as structural connectivity, or how difficult it is for a generalized species, in this case, to move across the landscape, since we were interested in conservation more broadly. The tool does also allow for the modeling of connectivity based on a specific species behavior, as well as empirical movement data, but that was outside the scope of what we were doing. From there, I ultimately used portions of these data sets to inform the planning tool. The subsets I used here were to create what we called locked-in layers. Essentially, we are forcing them to be part of a conservation solution, or areas that are selected. And so again, the one on the left looked at protected areas and the least cost paths between them. The thinking here was that we wanted just the core pathways between protected areas, allowing our prioritization tool to build them out into thicker corridors with lands that had ecological merit. On the right is the top 2 quantiles of connectivity flow from the omniscape output, or in other words, the 20% of lands that were deemed most connected. For the thesis that I wrote, I ended up running 6 different planning scenarios that focused on present conditions, predicted future conditions under climate change for the 2050s and 2080s, and connectivity. But I think where a lot of the power in this tool lies is that the nation can run whatever scenarios they want with it moving forward. To give you an idea of what the outputs of this tool look like, here's the present day solution in green. I'll highlight one focal area. This is a portion of the Amanika River Valley, which would provide a crucial connection for wildlife between Susta and Amanika provincial parks. And it was likely selected for its bull trout habitat and low to moderate elevation caribou habitat. I was lucky enough to visit Prince George last week and stop by the Chucho Environmental Office. They're a consulting firm owned by the nation. And I learned that they're actually using the linkage mapper output, omniscape output, and traditional ecological knowledge on known grizzly areas to strategically place camera traps for a long-term grizzly bear study. Always cool to hear that your stuff's actually being used. And another practical outcome that stands out for me is how the nation has used the omniscape output to help refine some of the boundaries of the proposed Ingenika Conservation and Management Area. And that is an ongoing effort by the nation to create an Indigenous Protected and Conserved Area, or IPCA, in the Ingenika River watershed, which is culturally and spiritually important to the Seike Dene. The Ingenika is also home to the Chase caribou herd. Not only are caribou, or wedzi in the Sicanni language, important to the people, but the nation has been working specifically to rebound this herd by decommissioning old resource roads in their habitat. Practically, my analysis and this tool provide an actionable strategy to systematically assess resource extraction referrals that the nation receives from industry. And so that should lead to better conservation outcomes in the short term, as these individual projects can be better assessed for how they fit into the larger landscape puzzle. Longer term, it also provides a means of selecting areas for official conservation designations or other management practices. So in closing, I sought an outcome of inclusion and reciprocity by attempting to interweave the knowledge and values of the Seike Dene throughout the project. The main goal of this work was to benefit the nation and the land its people call home. At the same time, this effort benefited immensely from the invaluable knowledge of these Indigenous land stewards and those working on their behalf. And so the intent really is that the nation will be able to use the tool over the long term and continue to adapt, expand, and apply it. That'll allow the nation to leverage these multiple ways of knowing and help lay the foundation for informed and defensible land use decisions that support both people and the land into the future. I have loads of folks to thank for this project. Here's some of the main players' logos, though, but in the interest of time, I will wrap it up. Thank you very much for listening. I'm looking forward to a hearty discussion. I've got my contact info up here if anyone wants it, as well as a QR code that takes you to a set of links about the project if you are interested. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris. That was very interesting. So that the GIS work has incredible implications for planning, what I can see. I guess my question we have for you is, I can see the amount of effort you've put into this, the analysis that you've done, but is it feasible for planning departments at a local level or at a government level to have the time and resources to plan in such a way? And how would they go about making sure those resources are in place?
Very fair question. From a connectivity standpoint, I would say that, the analyses that I ran do involve a learning curve for sure. I have a GIS background, but had not worked with any of these tools prior to starting grad school in fall of 2019. So I think if a planning department has GIS folks on staff and they have enough bandwidth to take on something like this, I absolutely think they could learn how to do it. I largely did it through learning or reading documentation from other folks on how to execute these analyses. And, it's not a huge community either. So you can absolutely reach out to folks. I know I reached out to some of the people at Conservation Biology Institute for help kind of just discerning how to analyze this data, like how to use the outputs in the end. So I acknowledge that there's a learning curve to understanding how to use these tools, but I don't think it's insurmountable if you have some GIS folks on staff.
That sounds really positive. So most places are able to basically use the technology and the tools that you've talked about today.
I think so, yeah.
That's wonderful, Chris. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
A bit later on.
Okay.
Wonderful. Okay, we'll go on to our third presenter. And our third presenter today is Dr. Mead Crosby, who's a senior scientist with the University of Washington Climate Impacts Group and the University Deputy Director of the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. That's a mouthful. Dr. Crosby works closely with land and wildlife managers, policymakers, and communities to collaboratively understand and address climate impacts on natural systems and the people who depend on them. Her current works includes vulnerability assessment and adaptation planning, large landscape conservation planning for climate resilience, and efforts to build climate adaptation capacity in communities of practice. Dr. Crosby received a Bachelor of Science in Biology from Cornell University and a PhD in Biology from the University of Washington. Welcome.
Thank you. Let me pull up my slides. There we go. You seeing that all right?
Not yet.
No?
No, we're not seeing it yet.
Okay, here, let me try one more time.
Yes, we got it now.
Awesome. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm joining you all from Seattle, Washington on Coast Salish land that touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Duwamish, Puyallup, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. And I'm going to talk today about an effort to support resilient, connected landscapes in a changing climate through the Blueprint for a Resilient Cascadia. And I want to recognize that I'm presenting the collaborative work of the Cascadia Partner Forum, who I'm going to tell you more about in just a moment. So this work focuses on what we're calling Cascadia, the Cascades Mountains and their surrounding lowlands, where they span the border of Washington and British Columbia, the area encircled in blue here. This region offers an important natural north-south corridor and elevational relief that's important for wildlife as they respond to climate change. Because one of the primary ways that species adapt to changing climate is by shifting their ranges, where they're found on the landscape, to track shifting climates. And on average, species have been moving upward in latitude, upward in elevation as climate warms. And so these kinds of north-south and elevational corridors are really important at a large landscape scale for helping species adapt. Cascadia is home to fish and wildlife and natural and cultural values that are key to our region's health and well-being. But at the same time, we're seeing human populations booming across the region, which is driving rapid land development, and the impacts of climate change are already being felt through things like increasing wildfire, drought, sea level rise, and a range of other impacts. The pace and the scale of the changes that we're seeing are making it difficult for Cascadia's resource managers, who manage our natural lands, fish, and wildlife, to meet their missions of conserving Cascadia's natural systems. And this is exacerbated by the fact that our natural lands are managed as a patchwork of many, many individual jurisdictions that act effectively as islands in a sea of rapid landscape change, when what we need is large-scale, coordinated land and wildlife management. So no individual landowner or jurisdiction is going to be able to meet its conservation goals without working across borders and boundaries, given the pace of change that we're seeing and the need for wildlife and ecological processes to move freely across landscapes to adapt. So what we need is coordinated conservation at a landscape scale. The Cascadia Partner Forum was formed in 2012 to help address that need. It's a network of natural resource managers and other conservation partners in Washington and British Columbia who recognize the need to work across borders for conservation planning at the scale of climate change. And the Partner Forum has been leading an effort to develop a transboundary climate adaptation strategy to help coordinate management of our natural lands, fish, and wildlife across jurisdictional boundaries in Washington and British Columbia to promote a resilient, connected Cascadia. So again, when we talk about Cascadia, we're talking about this area encircled here in blue. And when we talk about a resilient Cascadia, we're talking about one that maintains its ecological and cultural values in the face of a changing climate. Things like having intact core areas of habitat, so relatively large, unfragmented areas of habitat that's in good ecological condition. We're talking about a landscape that is ecologically connected, so there's relatively unrestricted movement of species and ecological processes across the landscape. One that's biodiverse, that maintains its native species, recognizing that with climate change, we may be seeing some of these native species shifting out of the area and others moving in as wildlife adapts. We want to see a region that is resilient to disturbances that may become more severe, frequent, or large due to climate change. So are all of these systems able to bounce back after fire, after flood, after other disturbances? And also a region that contains refugia from climate change. And these are areas that might be relatively buffered from the full impacts of climate change, maybe warming, smaller areas that might warm not as much, might be see less severe fire, areas that might be relatively buffered where species can refuge, they can hunker down and persist in place as the climate changes. So many of us, including the talks that you just heard, many of us have spent much of our careers developing the models and the science that are needed to inform actions managers could take to support these components of a resilient ecological landscape. And yet, time and again, we come up against significant barriers to implementing those actions at the large landscape scale, particularly working across those jurisdictional and political boundaries. So we've developed in Washington with our partners in British Columbia in the past, these amazing models and maps of key areas for connectivity conservation. And while we've seen piecemeal uptake and implementation, that vision is almost never realized because of barriers that are not necessarily science-based, and they're barriers that are not necessarily on the ecological landscape. It's often on the socio-political landscape where we find barriers to implementation. Things like lack of capacity. Do managers and conservation practitioners have the time, the resources, the person power, the information that they need to take action? Are they coordinated in the way that they need to be to work across that patchwork of jurisdictions and boundaries? Are they motivated? Is there a broad scale awareness, recognition of the urgency and the need to take action? Even if all of those were in place, they had the capacity, they were coordinated, and they were motivated, so often they simply don't have the authority to take the action that's needed. The policies and the mandates are in place are not sufficient to allow them to act in the timeliness or at the scales that are needed to take action required. And then even if all of that was in place, so often the funding is not there for implementation. Implementing is expensive. It requires significant financial investment to take the necessary actions for resilience at the scale required. So all of these socio-political enabling conditions need to be in place to support the kinds of ecological conditions required for transboundary landscape scale climate adaptation for a resilient Cascadia. And so the blueprint for a resilient Cascadia was designed and taken up as a way to take a close look at those barriers, those sociopolitical barriers, and an opportunity to really step back from doing all the science to say what we need to do on the landscape, to say, why does that science so often not implemented? And so to better understand those barriers and identify key strategies and actions for addressing them, the Blueprint for a Resilient Cascadia was co-produced by a group of participants representing a wide range of entities engaged in conservation and climate adaptation in Cascadia. These included federal entities, private entities, First Nations and tribes, philanthropies, nonprofits, provincial and state government, research institutes and universities. Approximately 48 different individuals were closely involved in creating this blueprint from across British Columbia and Canada. And all of this work was guided by the Cascadia Partner Forum's Indigenous engagement principles, emphasizing the need for responsibility, reciprocity, relevance, relationality, and resources in working closely with Indigenous partners in this work and in the strategies and actions that we identify. So together, in considering barriers to implementation of climate resilience at a large landscape scale, our participants identified 6 overarching strategies to support a resilient, connected Cascadia across jurisdictional and political boundaries. The first strategy recognizes the need to establish a formal governance structure that facilitates strategic and coordinated large landscape resilience across boundaries. Because Cascadia is divided into this patchwork of varied land uses and tenures and jurisdictions, connectivity and adaptation efforts to date have been piecemeal across the region. So to achieve large landscape transboundary resilience, we need a formal governance structure to ensure equitable and effective decision-making, resource sharing, and cooperative management across the region. And this needs to be codified within an appropriate transboundary agreement so that this work has the authority and the legitimacy of cooperative governance efforts. So these kind of agreements are in place elsewhere, things like memoranda of understanding, joint resolutions. These have been successfully implemented in other transboundary regions of the US and Canada and elsewhere around the globe, and we don't have something like this in place in Cascadia. The second strategy recognizes the need to center Indigenous leadership, sovereignty, and values in all aspects of this work to promote reconciliation and long-term success. We know that globally, nobody does a better job of conserving biodiversity than Indigenous peoples. 80% of global biodiversity is found in Indigenously managed landscapes. So centering Indigenous knowledge, recognizing their sovereignty on the landscape is going to be key to doing this effectively and in a way that promotes reconciliation and success. The third strategy calls for the need to mainstream transboundary large landscape resilience into existing decision-making structures at all levels of government and management. So we know climate resilience efforts are most successful when they're integrated into what people are already doing, existing management plans and decision-making, rather than when they're siloed into separate climate plans or connectivity plans. So this is recognizing the need to align and integrate into everything that is being done by government and other conservation partners on the landscape. The fourth strategy recognizes the need to conduct joint assessments, monitoring, and evaluation across the political borders of the Cascadia region. So working across boundaries to assess the ecological health and resilience of the landscape. So we have a shared understanding of what is the status of our landscape, where should we be prioritizing conservation, connectivity, and resilience efforts, and to support monitoring and evaluation so we know whether we've been successful. We also recognize the need to invest in relationship building. So we have the social capital, political commitment, and public support for this kind of work. So bringing in local communities, building buy-in and support, identifying political champions that want to support and move forward this work. And finally, the need to have a sustainable funding model. It's expensive to implement. So establishing funding that aligns with existing and emergent programs to move blueprint strategies and supporting actions forward. All of these strategies are described with additional detail and supporting actions and justification in a summary report that is located on the Blueprints website with the Cascadia Partner Forum. There's an interactive Resilient Cascadia Action Library where you can look at all of the supporting actions for each of these strategies in more detail. And we're now also working to support implementation. And so, for example, around joint assessment, we've been partnering with Google to build a powerful new tool called TerraAdapt to support conservation and connectivity conservation in a changing climate by using satellite imagery and other information to provide always up-to-date information about our rapidly changing landscape. In the past, when we've built these connectivity models, these other resilience models, they're static, they're obsolete the moment they're done. This is an automated cloud-based model that works on a schedule to automatically update so we know what's going on in the landscape and what the needs are and how successful our efforts are. So our focus now is on working towards implementation of the blueprint, especially helping to put the leadership in place to own and move forward each of the strategies, providing the facilitated support and information needed so that together we can help realize this landscape scale vision for a connected, resilient Cascadia. So we're not just we've produced so many cool models in the past and haven't necessarily seen those visions realized. And we're really looking forward to now thinking through all of the barriers that have been in place to realizing these landscape scale visions, and now couching the science in this larger context of the socio-political needs moving forward. So if there's any questions, please go ahead and reach out. Thank you.
Thank you, Mead. Thank you. That was very exciting and so great to see how much work you've done on this. Gives us a lot of hope. So the question I have for you, it's for so if a group, for example, we're on Vancouver Island, if we're interested in creating such a landscape, such a corridor across Vancouver Island, and we're early stages, what are some of the things we need to put into place to get these partners together, to start a group, put a group together to get us on the road that you've gone on?
Yeah, so thinking back on how all of this began, we have sort of deep roots in this work in that there was an effort called the Washington Connected Landscapes Project that I was really lucky to be involved in the beginning. And that one of the things that was so helpful there was that there was a mandate. So their Washington Department of Transportation and Washington Fish and Wildlife together provided in-kind staff support to move this effort forward. And so it is helpful if there can be some kind of any kind of political support to provide someone, the importance of having someone whose job it is, who's really committed to like moving an effort like this forward is incredibly helpful. And then if you don't have that money to begin with or that capacity, seeking out capacity to ensure that it's somebody's responsibility to convene meetings, have those initial small phone calls of like, we're all really stoked to do this. This is key to our mission. Who else has missions that aligns with this work? Who would want to join forces with us and kind of snowball out from there? And right now, I mean, even having done all this work, we're writing a lot of big grants right now because you still have to, making it self-sustaining is so hard. So that was a lot of sort of scattered thoughts based on our history doing this work in the region. But in the past, some things that have been very helpful were just having that finding some way to support some committed staff time to having someone move this forward and facilitate those conversations.
That's great. And it's so good to see that structure that you've outlined, because once people get started, they can follow that path. So that's excellent. Thank you so much. Shauna, are we going to go on to something different right now?
Yeah, so for just 1 second, I'm going to remove Mead, and I'm just going to share this thought exchange thing one more time. I've put it in the comments a couple of times, so folks can take a look at it, but I'm just going to share my screen here for folks. So right now you can see that some folks have shared their ideas that we need a stronger emphasis on conservation and long-term restoration planning. This has been upvoted a couple of times. This kind of goes back to what Mead was saying about how funding can be unsustainable for objectives like this. So we've heard that maybe long-term funding models that support 10, 20, 50-year investments in conservation and restoration action is one thing we can do. So these are just some ideas that have been shared. If you just use this QR code here, you can scan it right now from your screen, or you can use the links that have been shared earlier in the chat. Feel free to do so. And I'm just going to take this off for now, so it's not dominating the conversation. We can maybe share it right at the end, but I'll bring all of our presenters back. So there's Mead, there's Chris, and Angela, and I'll hop off to let you take it away.
Thanks, Shauna. And I think the first question I'm going to ask all our presenters is what everybody's talking about on the side there is, what can local governments do to make sure that conservation connectivity is a key part of their planning process as they look into our communities into the future? So what do we need to have happen in the local level and the regional level to make sure that happens? Angela, can we start with you?
Yeah, that's the question I was going to ask Mead, actually, because I think this was like brought up in strategy 3, which I think is just it's key not to silo connectivity and not to silo resilience as these separate issues, to mainstream them, to bring them in and have them a part of the regular discussion with any kind of land use planning. I mean, ultimately, I think that's the way we're going to find success, is for people to understand the impact. Yeah.
Me?
Yeah, what I would note, though, that even that mainstreaming will never happen without a mandate. And so that's why number one is around that formal codification of this. It's very hard. We are all, I assume this is the same situation up there, but all of our land and wildlife managers are just completely strapped in terms of capacity, right? They already have so much to do. And you're like, by the way, can you please also voluntarily incorporate connectivity conservation and, climate resilience into your work? And it's like, but if they have a mandate and it's in their work plan, because that's they're required to do it, then it's much more likely to get done. And so that then enables that mainstreaming, right? Because it's like, oh, we're all sort of mandated to be doing this. And so some examples of that, there's a joint resolution in the Northeast among Northeast premiers and governors around connectivity conservation. And part of that joint resolution is around mainstreaming. And so it seems like, from what I've heard, they're having success in getting it integrated into everything that they do in a way that would, despite all our work here in Washington, it's very difficult to get even folks who really want to do this work. It's hard they just don't have the mandate to do it, and they won't without it.
Yeah, yes, obviously that makes sense. Chris, do you have anything to add to that?
I think I would echo Mead's point about the mandate. I work with our fish and wildlife biologists, and yeah, their plates are full already, just being out in the land and doing their biology things. So yeah, there needs to be some sort of formal aspect to that. In terms of what local municipalities can do, I think it would be cool if somebody could essentially step up and do a connectivity analysis for Vancouver Island. I have to imagine somebody's already done that. But then from there, local municipalities could look at, what they have jurisdiction over and what they could potentially do within their realm of influence.
The one thing I'll note is that if the managers are involved in that analysis, they're much more likely to use it. So I would encourage if you can do it in partnership with them, it's much more likely to be used.
Mm-hmm. And I want to point out that both of you have these really great examples of these kind of interactive tools that can bring people together to learn more about connectivity and how it applies to that specific area. And, like this TerraDAP thing too, I'm super excited about that. Love to ask you lots of questions about that. But Nithya, sorry,
No, that's great. This is a discussion, so absolutely. I think that what we're finding is there's a huge disconnect with the urgency of the now, with wildfires, with droughts, with floods, and this long-term vision, and how do you get past that huge barrier of that immediate urgency, which is happening more and more with climate change impacts? What do you think? That was a tough question, I know. But isn't that something that the most managers and planners are coping with today? It's really difficult to plan for the long term.
Yeah, I feel like we have a lot of fires, using that kind of analogy, going on right now. There's a lot that people are trying to plan for and think of. So it's a difficult landscape, I think, to try to navigate.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I see one question has come up from our viewers is the Y-to-Y corridor. We've heard a lot about it, and it's something that we all look to. And maybe each one of you could talk a little bit about how that corridor has either affected your work or how you see your work as being either validated or how it's reflected in the Y-to-Y corridor. So somebody start with that.
I'll start because they helped fund my project a little bit. Yeah, I think our work was a subset of the wider Y-to-Y region. They do split up that entire corridor, and so it was fascinating to think about how we were focused on the territory proper and sort of that broader study area around it, and just trying to understand how connectivity affects the Cascadia territory itself and the management implications of that, and then think about that itself is a very large portion of land, and the fact that that is just one piece of the whole Y-to-Y puzzle.
Absolutely. Angela or Mead?
Yeah, my work, so the global functional connectivity analysis really highlighted the Yellowstone to Yukon corridor as an area that's important for maintaining connectivity across North America. The Cascadia region was also highlighted in that analysis. So these were basically among the highest values of mammal movement probability across the globe. So it was nice to see that the analysis kind of corroborated the importance of these areas for connectivity.
Absolutely.
I was going to say the same thing, that Y-to-Y, having been around for some time, they've now been able to validate with some research the value of these large landscape efforts and their effectiveness. And that's very helpful to have that data to point to, that it's worthwhile taking this large landscape approach. It's effective. And just seeing such an ambitious vision, right? It's huge, and that they've been effective working at such a large scale, and the value of having that kind of large landscape vision has also been helpful. It's helpful to see it being done. It's interesting though that there's also there have been some useful lessons there too, in that in the beginning of Y-to-Y, I have colleagues here who were hesitant to engage in kind of a large landscape vision for Cascadia, because initially the large landscape sort of Y-to-Y vision was quite polarizing among folks in the landscape. Is this a big land grab? What is this thing, right? And so there's lessons learned there around how to communicate this vision and how to sort of step into it in a way that can avoid some of that early conflict by bringing in communities and pointing to the values for communities and nature.
I think as we go along, we're seeing more and more tools and processes, which is helping us, which the early Y-to-Y didn't have. So I think it's really good. We have a thought here on Thought Exchange, and somebody's saying education is important. How do we educate people about the importance of connectivity conservation, especially transboundary connectivity conservation? And who are the people who need to be educated? Any thoughts on that?
I might throw out one really cool example, which is that in California, when they were doing connectivity work and sort of establishing a vision and wanting to move some wildlife corridors forward, they had efforts in the schools they had a contest, like a drawing contest of, wildlife overpasses and things like that. And so getting to the parents from the children can be really an effective communication measure. There's also been research, for example, showing that nobody is more effective at swaying the beliefs about climate change for men than their daughters, their young daughters. And so like it's very useful to work in schools to build some of that, build in some of that community knowledge and valuing of connectivity.
That makes sense. Any other ideas?
I think trying to convey to transportation planners the importance of, not severing a landscape to begin with, if that's possible, but otherwise the value in overpasses or underpasses, and even just speaking in dollar amounts, if that's what it comes down to. Y2Y has some great resources about the financial impacts. Now you can actually save money in the long run by building these overpasses or underpasses and avoiding some of the collisions that would occur if there was no overpass or underpass.
Oops. I think we have time for one more question. So First Nations have been telling us for decades that political boundaries don't align with territorial ones. And the idea of transboundary connectivity conservation brings us to mind. So how do we best bring Indigenous expertise and traditional knowledge into the decision-making processes?
I'll take a stab at that too. I think that is really challenging. I think, in my case, I felt validated in the sense that the nation was the one that initiated the project. It wasn't just me, some research university guy, coming to them and saying, hey, give me your knowledge, right? And so I think it starts with building a relationship of trust and identifying common outcomes, common goals, and basically trying to build those relationships with folks to then work together to reach that outcome that you're looking for.
I think what we're seeing is a long process. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. And I think we need to be prepared for that. Unfortunately, the problem is that we're running out of options as in the long run, aren't we? So there's a balance of making this happen and expecting this to take a long time, while every day that it takes, we might lose another piece of connectivity that is important. Yeah. How do we resolve that? Any ideas? These are all the tough questions we're all facing. I think there are probably no answers, but I feel that we're all doing the little bits that we can to move us in the direction. And as it's a group of us here who are working on a corridor in Vancouver Island, and I have a feeling we'll be contacting all three of you to get all the great ideas you had today, to see if we can go into them a little bit deeper and see how they can help us with our corridor. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Shauna?
Thanks everyone so much for being here. Thanks to the audience members who have stuck it out with us 8 minutes past our end time. It's always really hard to end these sessions when the conversation is so rich and we have such brilliant minds willing to share their expertise with us. So thank you everyone for being here. Thank you to the speakers as well as to the audience members. I just want to remind everyone that we have one more session left in Project Teach that's happening at the same time next week, and it's on recreation and conservation, the balancing act. So that will build really beautifully, I think, on this presentation. So be sure to tune in for that. Dr. Cole Burton, who has been one of the co-organizers of this whole effort, will be presenting, so that'll be really interesting to hear from him. We also have our in-person session on June 23rd in a couple of weeks in Victoria. And that's going to be a place where we all come together and really talk about how we can apply some of the science that we've been learning through these sessions. So I really encourage anyone who's going to be in Victoria on June 23rd to join us for that. So with that, we will end things off. Thank you again, everyone, for being here, and hope to see you soon.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.